Hold on. Okay. Which screen are you seeing? Are you seeing the presentation?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Do you see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And you're just seeing one window, right?
Yeah, we're just seeing the presentation only. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Sorry about that. I'm not used to sharing on Teams.
Oh, no
Okay.
worries, no worries. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll be talking about how you can add motion in your Angular applications and what options you have at your disposal, and which ones to choose when. So before we dive into the how, let me give you some examples on what you can do in an Angular application. Since this isn't a talk about animation, so it's just a heads up for everyone. There will be some animations playing throughout the presentation because I have some demos I want to show you. Okay, let's get to it. Okay. So this is a demo I did for Auth0. This is an Angular project. So this is an Angular app. It uses minimal external libraries. So most of this is done using just Angular animations, CSS animations, web animations, and all that. So you get pretty much a lot of stuff just using those basic technologies you have. So let's see some mobile examples as well that uses Angular. So this is another demo app I did using Ionic. I've heard some of you used Ionic before. So this is just a really basic stagger animation that I added that you could. This is Angular animations that you could use in an Ionic app. So another mobile example, this is another project I did for NativeScript. NativeScript is a hybrid framework similar to Ionic. It has some different underlying features, but it's also a cross-platform framework, and you could use it with Angular. So for this particular video you're seeing, all the animations that are done here are strictly using Angular animations. So you could use Angular animations in a mobile app in a pretty powerful way. And you could implement a lot of complex animations just using it. So maybe you prefer something that has spring animation similar to React's Framer Motion or React Spring. You could also do that in Angular using Pop Motion, which is pretty cool. So now let's get into the details. Every time I talk about animations, I often always get asked this question. With so many different animation techniques and libraries out there, how do I know which ones would work well with Angular? And if it does, which ones to use when? So the goal of this talk is to give you a high-level overview of the common and some niche animation options that you can start using in your project, along with their use cases. So I'll be breaking down this presentation into 4 parts. We'll go from the basic to the more advanced one going down the list. So we have CSS animations, Angular animations, and then web animation APIs, and some third-party libraries which work well with Angular. This is not an exhaustive list of what options we have. This is more of just the ones that I find commonly used in Angular projects. Okay, so let's start with CSS animations. Why CSS animations? These are performant, powerful, and these are also basically platform agnostic. So if you know how to use CSS animations in an HTML project or a React project or a Vue project, you could use the same thing in an Angular project. So you get that transferable knowledge when you move between frameworks. So you can use CSS animations and transitions for a few various different use cases. One of the most common ones that people use this for are hover animations. You could use CSS transitions in just a few lines to add a hover animation to change its opacity or do some transforms, or do whatever you want that gets triggered by a hover. You could also do a more complex hover animation using CSS keyframes. This is the same code you would see in a regular non-Angular project, and you could use the exact same code in an Angular project. Another good use case of CSS animations are infinite animations, especially if you don't really care about the events of when it's done or when you started. So you could run an infinite CSS animation just by adding that class and then stop it by removing it. And then you also get some browser events that gets triggered when the animation starts and ends. So similarly, like I mentioned before, you could start and stop animations by adding and removing CSS classes. And that's regardless whether the animations are infinite or not. So what this means is this opens up the possibility of using third-party CSS animation libraries, which uses the same concept of adding and removing classes to trigger the animations. You might have seen like CSS libraries such as Animate CSS. I think it's called Animate Style now, that uses this exact same concept. So what you would do in an Angular project differently compared to a regular non-Angular project is how you would add and remove that class. In Angular, you get this nice binding ability between the class names and a variable or a condition. So you would be able to add and remove classes just based on a condition that you bind to it. So in this example, you see class.bouncingUp. That's binded to an element is displayed variable. So once that's true, the bounce in up class gets applied, and then once it's false, it gets removed. And you get this bouncy animation from the utility class that Animate CSS provides you. Another one is Tailwind. I know Tailwind is more used for layouts and styling, but it does have some animation utility classes as well. And this works the exact same way as Animate CSS. So you have the option to use these as well. One difference is the Tailwind animations are mostly infinite animations. So it has those pulsing and shimmer, those kind of animations. If you're looking for those kind of animations, you should definitely check out Tailwinds. Okay, so let's move on to Angular animations. Why Angular animations? It's performant. It uses web animation APIs and falls back to CSS animation. So you can be sure that these animations are performant out of the box, excluding that you animate properties that aren't as performant. So what makes Angular animations very powerful is their ease of use and their out of the box support for a few of these properties. So you could easily add enter and leave animation, state changes, and then some timing and sequencing such as staggers, and also the ability to animate multiple elements. So you could target multiple elements at once and animate them together with different timings and sequences as you choose. To use Angular animations, the setup is pretty simple. You just import the browser animations module to the module that you want to use the animations, and then you have all the Angular animations at your disposal. This is the basic anatomy of what Angular animations comprises of. It basically contains these 5 properties. I'll go over it briefly here, and then it'll make more sense for those who aren't familiar with this as much as we go through the different examples of where this is used and how these are used. So the trigger is what the animation is called. So that's the property that gets binded to your element in your HTML. State defines the multiple different states, actually, not just 2. So you could define however many states you want, and then their appropriate styling, which you use the style property to define those stylings. And then the transitions is what animations you want to play when you transition between these two different states. And then lastly, the animate function is what you pass in, the actual animation code that you pass in. So this would have duration, delays, curves, and all that. Okay, so let's start with the simplest of the Angular animation. This is state change. So you define two states. Right here, if you see the top right code snippet, I have two states defined, the default state and then disabled state. So, and then if you see the code snippet at the bottom, I just have that trigger, the enabled state change animation name, and it's binded to an enabled flag. Here is enabled as a Boolean. So it'll, if it's true, it goes to default. If it's false, it goes to disabled state. And then the transition here defines what animation that it has to execute when it changes state between default to disabled or disabled to default. And then you get this opacity switch with a slight scale change you see on the left. So enter and leave is another common one that I would typically use Angular animations over CSS animations. It just lets you, so ngIfs are a very common way in Angular to add elements to the DOM. So you add it conditionally, and then if it doesn't pass the check, it'll remove the element. So you could add enter and leave animations to it just by adding the animation trigger name to that element. So if you see the code snippet below, a regular div with an ngIf, you just get ngIf is displayed, and then you get that element appearing and disappearing. But with this fade slide in out, you get this nice fading effect, or whatever animation you want to add it, and you can define it just by using :enter and :leave. So with that, the enter and leave animations, you could also target multiple elements all at once. And so if the parent is added to the DOM, you could target its children. So you play their children's animation based on the parent's condition. Okay, this is similar to keyframes, how CSS keyframes work, with a slightly different syntax to control your animation timings. So on keyframes, you go from 0% to 100%. For Angular animations, you go from an offset. So what the percentages on CSS keyframes is called offsets here. So it goes from 0 to 1, and then you can break it up into as many decimals as you want. And then this basically defines the steps between each style that you want to animate. So right here, I have 3 keyframes. If you see on the top part of the code snippet, you have style opacity 1 at offset 0.3. And then it goes down from there. So it executes it in the order of the offsets. And this works, this follows the same logic as how a CSS keyframes would work. So another really powerful functionality of Angular animation is stagger. This is implementing this using just pure CSS would end up with a lot more code and the code would be a lot more complex. Angular lets you do this in a pretty straightforward way, just by passing in the amount of delay you want to add between the two animation executions. So this, stagger is, so what stagger is when you add a delay between the execution of your animations. So as you see here, we add 100 millisecond delay between the start of the first animation to the second. So if you see the first box, the yellow box, once it starts animating, it waits for 100 milliseconds before starting the next one. And then it waits another 100 milliseconds before starting the next one. So what's different between this and how you would write a regular animation, Angular animation code is you pass in the delay in your stagger function. So instead of passing in animate directly, you pass in animate through a stagger function. And then, so when you add animations, oftentimes you will also need a way to disable the animations for various scenarios. I'll go over some of these scenarios and the various way you can handle those. So here you have the disabled, I guess you could call it a special directive. So what this does is it'll disable all its children's animation. So if you want to disable everything in your app, you could add this disable directive on your topmost level component, and it will disable everything, everything in terms of Angular animation. This won't affect CSS animations or other ways you added animation, but this will disable all Angular animations. There's one gotcha for this though. This won't affect elements that are added to the DOM directly. So those such as modals or components that are added through a factory or a renderer, these won't be able to disable those. So another scenario where you want to disable animations is when testing. So this comes up a lot usually when I'm testing, when I run unit tests. Do I actually have to wait for my animations to execute? And then you end up with this like seconds of animation delays between your tests, and then your test takes forever just because it's waiting for your animations to execute. So you could, instead of passing in the browser's animation module like we talked about earlier, you could pass in the no operation animations module. And then what this does is it skips all the execution of your animations, and then it skips directly to the last frame. So your test doesn't have to wait for your animations anymore. So this is a new property that came out, I think, earlier this year with version 12. It lets us pass in a condition to disable animations at runtime. So this is pretty cool because, so like this example, this code snippet, when the users have a prefers reduced motion setting on their browser, you could essentially disable all your Angular animations related code just by passing in this Boolean value. And this could be, you could have a toggle in your app, or this could be any external factor as well. So is Angular animations only limited to web? And the short answer is no. So let's see where else we can use it. So you could use the same Angular animations on an Ionic app. There's no difference to using it in an Angular app, but so the imports are the same, and then how you structure it would be the same. You could also use it in the NativeScript app. The only difference here is instead of importing the browser's animation module, you import the NativeScript animation module. And then everything else after that is the same. So you structure the animation code the exact same way. So this was one of the demos I showed earlier, where I'm using Angular animations. So where you see the stagger effect here when the page first loads, those are using the stagger, Angular's animation stagger. So I add a few milliseconds delay between everything, and then it transforms and then fades in. And then the menu opens. So if you see, like when I click on the hamburger menu and then it slides to the right and scales down, that's done by using a state change animation through Angular animations. So you could chain some of those animations together to get these nice effect of having two layers stacked somewhat with a parallax effect. And then, so all this code are on a public repo that I can share with Wayne after this. So you'll have reference to all these code if you ever need it in the future. And then the last one is the bottom sheet. So the bottom sheet is using the enter and leave animation. So when the condition is true, I slide it up, and then when the condition is false, I slide it down. So what does this mean, being able to use Angular animations outside web and using it in different platforms such as mobile? And why should you care, or how does that impact your Angular apps or how you write those? So this so sharing animation code has this benefit of giving you consistent experiences across different platforms, and also you don't have to rewrite the same animation code multiple times. So if you're using a shared workspace like NX or Lerna, you could essentially put your animation code in a shared directory that you could use um, on different apps. So essentially, you're writing it once, and then you could use it on different platforms, even not just multiple apps. You could run the same animation code on a web project, on an iOS app, or on an Android app, all via one code base, which I think is pretty cool and is a pretty powerful thing that Angular animations provide. Okay, let's move on to our next option, which is web animation APIs. And then, just like the previous sections, why would we want to use web animation APIs? There's a few advantages with this since it uses JavaScript. What I think makes this approach powerful is that the level of control it gives you. It lets you control the sequences and animation states at a more granular level, and at the same time still keeps it very performant. This is excluding when you try to animate certain properties that are expensive to animate. This is particularly useful for animations that are based on some dynamic values. So examples of those includes like your cursor's position. Say you want to move an element from one position to your cursor's position. Those would be, I would say, impossible to do using CSS animations or Angular animations where everything is static. But this is where web animation APIs come in. So let's go through some of these functionalities in more detail. Sequencing of your animations. You can chain animations not only on the same element, but on different elements using promises. So you would structure it the same way as you would write promises for an API call or for whatever function you have, and then you would just chain it using the dens. So if you see on the left side, you have these three boxes which are chained using the promises.then, and then it executes one after the other. Also, you get more control on animation play states. So you get to play the animation. You don't only get to stop the animation, but you can pause it and then resume it from that current pause state. And you could also reverse it. So it gives you more this level of control over your animations that I don't think any other techniques lets you do. And those are just a high-level overview of what JavaScript or web animation APIs can do. It has a lot more capabilities that I won't go too much in detail. So let's move on to the third-party libraries, because since the web animation APIs kind of segues nicely to this. So we covered some third-party CSS libraries in the beginning when I talked about CSS animations. I'm going to focus more on a different kind of third-party animation libraries. This one involves some JavaScript and an entirely different mechanism to create animations. So if you're wondering why third-party libraries that are these type of libraries, it lets you do more complex animations. So some use cases that aren't supported natively by CSS or web animation APIs, you could go for the third-party libraries. And also third-party libraries, as all third-party libraries, not only animations, you don't have to write your own code. So you get to use someone else's code that are battle tested, hopefully. So Greenstock is one of the more popular ones, and this is not just in terms of Angular. I'm going to skip through the setup and go directly to how it's used. So this one, Greenstock's most popular feature is its timeline. So you get to create this timeline where you get to animate elements based on where they are on the timeline. So this is what it looks like, and this is pretty much similar or the same as what you would see in a regular JavaScript project. So when you see a JavaScript example for Greenstock, those probably will work in an Angular app. The imports might be slightly different, but everything else should be the same. Lottie is another animation library. So if you see the left, the graphics on the left, those are Lottie animations that are running. Those are screen recordings, but those are Lottie animations that run on your browser. So you get this really fluid motion on your browser without having to write animation code. So for those who are not familiar with what Lottie is an animation library from Airbnb that renders animations created in Adobe After Effects. So you create this animation using Adobe's After Effects, and then those get exported as a JSON file. And then you use this NGX Lottie library in Angular, and then you would just pass in this JSON file, similar to how you would display a static image or an SVG, and then it would play the animation for you. And you get this fluid-like animation without having to write a single line of code to actually create those animations, which I think is pretty cool. Another one that I touched on briefly a while back was pop motion. So if you've heard Framer motion for React, pop motion is what powers Framer motion. We don't currently have an Angular wrapper for it, but we can still use it directly in our Angular animations to create Spring animations and all kinds of fancy animations like these. There are a few good resources that I'll share. I'll leave a link to. But this is essentially how you would create those animations. So this is this works similar to Greenstock's. You have this on update function, which basically you just have to set the style to your element, and then you can pass in the different curves. So you can make it. So here I have it of type Spring, but you could set all kinds of different controls over this. So you could set their damping, their stiffness, and all that, and then you would get different kind of Spring animation. So with this many options, how do I know which ones to use when? Like all of these type of questions, the answer is always it depends. Let's look at a few more examples. Let's say you want to animate something indefinitely, like an infinite animations. I would probably use CSS animations because it's easiest. You just have to add a class to that element to start the animation and then remove it when you want to stop it. So it kind of makes sense to use CSS animations over all those other more complex ones. Let's see another example. So what if you want to add a stagger effect to your elements as it enters or leaves the DOM? So for this, it would be more difficult to use CSS. So I would probably end up either writing a bunch of custom CSS code to handle the different timing, or I could just use Angular animations since it has that functionality built in. So one rule I usually follow when creating animations and when having to choose which option to use, I would always pick the simplest and easiest option possible. So as my talk, I went from the most basic to the more advanced ones. If I can go to the most basic ones first, then I would go for that before moving on to the more advanced ones. I guess this kind of depends on your use cases as well, but oftentimes you could already achieve a lot just using CSS and Angular animations, unless you're trying to do some really complex animations, such as the ones I showed with springs and those fluid motions. I think I'm reaching the end, towards the end of my presentation. So let me do a quick recap, and I'll share the link to this talk as well, so you have access to all the code snippets. So we talked about CSS animations and how you could use those and several use cases. Also Angular animations and its different features. And we went over how we could use web animation APIs to get when you want to create animations that you have more control over. And then lastly, we went over some third-party animation libraries, where when none of the three options above work well for your use case, then it's probably time to look for a third-party animation libraries that can hopefully support what you're looking for. I think with that, that's the end of my presentation. So.
Okay, thank you, William. Thank you for that amazing session. So I'd like to open this floor right now to any questions that you may have for William. So also, probably for starters, my question is, so you would like to have some sort of like animations, like with routing, right? Because
Right.
I think I've come across a couple of projects that require that kind of I don't know. I think user experience. How easy is that to implement it in terms of like routing instead of just single element?
Yeah, so Angular lets you wrap. So how you would do this in an Angular application is you usually have a router outlet. Either you have like one, you always have one on the top level, and then you might have nested ones.
Yeah.
So if you wrap that router outlet inside a div, and then you can bind that div with Angular animations, and then you have the same access to all the same Angular animations you would run on a single element, but you just run it on the container of the router outlet. So you essentially can animate the page itself and also trigger the children animation of each router outlet. So like you would essentially be able to animate the elements that are leaving the DOM when you navigate away from it, and then also trigger the elements that are entering the DOM from the page that you navigated to.
Oh, okay. Anyone else has a question to ask?
I think too, on top of that, like you've mentioned, when you have let's say a product page, and then you have like an overview, and you have details, and you have images, they are children and a product. So if we apply an animation to the parent router of the router where the children are being shown, if we have an entry and exit, so anytime you go to overview, it will apply the entry animation. If you exit and go maybe like to product details, it will apply the exit on the overview and apply entry on the product details. That is what you mean.
Yes, that's right. I think I might have an example for that particular use case. Let me stop sharing and then share a different screen. See if I can pull that up real quick.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let me share my screen again. Okay, let me know if you're seeing my screen.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a demo I Well, this is just a project I have. And then what you were talking about, the route animations, I have it wrap this entire thing. So when you switch between different pages, you have that exit and enter of the children playing.
Okay.
Yeah, so if I click on this one, it'll fade away, and then it enters with the new page. And these are, if you look at the URL, these are actual route changes.
Yeah.
So you get you can you have a lot of control over the route animations as well.
Okay, and does it usually have like repercussions when it comes to performance?
For route animations?
Just animations in general.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so it depends. So when you animate properties that are expensive to animate, so the browser goes through 4 steps, I believe. You have I think it's content, paint, layout. I think so there are certain properties that are less expensive and some properties that are more expensive. So the less expensive ones are like changing opacity, transforms, scales. Those are inexpensive, and those can usually be run on the GPU, so it's really performant. Especially, so you want to animate those that won't affect any other elements. So, for example, if I animate an element's opacity, so let's take this for an example. So if I want to animate this card's opacity, it will only animate this card. It won't affect any of these other elements. But if I animate this card's margin, it's going to be really expensive because it's going to push this not only this card down, but it's going to have to push all the other cards' position as well. So you're not only affecting this particular card, but you're affecting its siblings, its parents' container size would change. So you want to create animations that target a specific part and only that part, without affecting its children's, its parents, or its siblings. The more elements that gets affected, the less performant your animation becomes.
Okay. So would you personally advocate for animations for better user experience?
Yes. I think animations have its place. So you don't want to overdo it, of course, because it becomes, at a certain point, it becomes just a distraction. But something like this, where it signifies that this card is clickable, something like those, I think those are important for the UX. It's not nice to have. So I think like hover animations and some animations are actually crucial to the user experience. Some are just fun to add. Like some I actually did a blog post for Odd Zero, which I'll share some of the links with you, Wayne, after the talk.
Yeah.
Which goes over those in more detail. So covers when animation plays a big role for UX, and then where you don't want to add animations.
Okay.
Yeah. So to answer your question, I would advocate for using animations in a practical way that helps the user, not in a distracting way.
Oh, okay. I think those are my questions. Anyone else has a question? Okay, or even if it's a comment, appreciation, anything.
I think I have a comment.
Yeah, go on.
Sorry about that. I have two devices open and I always make this mistake of yeah. So I have a comment about what William said about the performance. So I think you just target you limit your animation to the element box, and you don't want to touch like margin, because it's, if you think about the box model, you just have to keep your animations limited to the element box and not go for something like the margin box or even the padding, I guess. In that way,
Right.
how do
Sorry, I don't think I got the last part of your question.
I was just looking for some validation, I guess. Is that how you'd like to reframe like what you just said?
Yes, yeah. I mean, actually, am I still sharing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I actually have that section here. So, yeah, so this is the order. Um, this is the order in which browser renders your elements. So the higher it is, so it goes styles, layout, paint, composite, and it has to go through these steps every time. So if you animate something that's on the composite layer, it would only affect the composite layer. But if you animate something on the paint layer, it wouldn't only affect paint, but it would have to do this step again. So if you animate something here, then it would have to go through this step, the layout step, the paint step, and the composite step. So you want to animate properties that are closer to the bottom. The higher it is, the more expensive it is, and then so the riskier it is to run into performance issues.
So, thank you.
Okay, anyone else who has a comment or a question? Okay, before I close the session, William, do you have any parting shot?
Yeah, I think so. So when it comes to animations, I think you can get really creative. So, and you get better at it by experimenting with it. So I don't think there's a straight like theoretical. There's some theories behind it, but like play around with it, and you'll get to learn more on like how to structure different kinds of animation. So don't be afraid to experiment when it comes to animation, and then use what works for you, because we have all these resources and tools at our disposal. So yeah, don't be afraid to try out animations. I know it can be intimidating, but you can always reach out to me if you have any questions too. So.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, William. Thank you for taking the time to take us through this session. I'm very sure that people have actually learned about this. I personally have worked on, not really worked on a project that required animation, but was more of I was learning about how to make the user experience better. And after seeing a lot of code with regards to animation, for me was I was a bit scared of it, because like I don't want to touch anything to do with animation, but at least like explaining it like makes even more sense on how even you could approach it. And yeah, as you also mentioned, like there are libraries out there you could leverage on, but of course it's on a use case basis. So yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for taking the time to really explain all this. Yeah, and for the members, thank you or attendees, thank you for joining us for this session. We usually have a session every Thursday, same time, 8:30 p.m. Eastern time, and we have different topics ranging, of course, from introduction to Angular all the way to the nitty-gritty details of Angular, and we're glad that you're here. And as usual, this session will be available tomorrow on our YouTube channel by afternoon. So you can definitely just head over to YouTube and search for Angular Kenya. You can subscribe, of course, turn the notification button, of course, just to always be notified of the recordings that will be dropping. Yeah, as William mentioned, he will share with me the slides link or any other materials or resources, and I will definitely put it in the description in the YouTube video. But yeah, if there's nothing else, I would like to bring the meeting to a close. And thank you, Wahida, for joining us all the way from Qatar. It's an amazing, it's usually amazing having people from across the world like joining us. And thank you, William, too. Where are you joining us from, William?
I'm from Indonesia.
Indonesia. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right. Yeah, if there's nothing else, yeah, I'd like to say thank you again, and I wish you all a very good evening.